Hello, and welcome to Hammer and Vajra episode. I'm not really keeping up with the episode count. Um, I had a bunch of requests to hopefully, one, make sure the audio is better this time than it was on the last episode, and two, to speak on paganism and or religious aspects within the Legend of Zelda franchise. I'm it's no joke for anybody now, or no hidden mystery that I am a little bit of a weeb. I think a lot of people are. Everybody has a little nerdity to them, but honestly, The Legend of Zelda is something that is so commonly in the world view and world understanding of just general pop culture that you'd be hard to find someone who hasn't been affected by The Legend of Zelda, and rightfully so. It's pretty popular series, entered in the pop culture mindset and pop culture understanding of just everybody's just of what everyone understands. It's worldwide famous, and it has a lot of different spiritual aspects to it. And there's, I will say, starting off, that it's one of those things where Zelda is such common knowledge to everybody, and there's a lot of allegories within Zelda. The Zelda series isn't something that has one allegory. So the request has been in the past, and has been multiple times, of just for me to discuss things within the Legend of Zelda that are pagan in nature. And of course, you're going to see a lot of videos. So if you look at the Legend of Zelda and religion or philosophy, etc., or mythology, you're going to see a lot of different videos online. Some of them are pretty decent, that have already covered some of the topics I'm going to cover today. So I'm not going to try to tread over the same topics that everyone else has done, so that I'm just making another video on the same topic. I also understand that apparently, for people who are fans, November is Zelda month, so I'm 2 months off. I figured I would use this for the start of the new year. I also don't. So at one point, on one hand, I really want to discuss the spiritual and religious connections that people can see in the Legend of Zelda. But on the other hand, I really don't want anyone to take a video game or a comic book series or a manga series or movies to be actual spirituality. They can inform people on spirituality, especially in your informative years, and when people are young, when you have children, and when teenagers are coming up. And I'll discuss that in a moment. With lack of religion, you'll see that people tend to cling to these things, or some of this pop culture that has other religion in it opens their eyes to other things, and it will always be a part of their understanding of spirituality. That being said, it shouldn't become something where it is their primary religion, which unfortunately, as I'll discuss in a moment, it kind of is. So with Legend of Zelda, see, we have in the 80s, right? In the 1980s, you had a sort of a return of paganism in some ways. Dungeons and Dragons, with the whole satanic panic, came back into focus, even though it was a little older than the 80s originally. And then you have things like a lot of the heavy metal started to bring, heavy metal bands and stuff started to bring in different forms of paganism that wasn't just satanic focused. Different forms of paganism was coming back within that. And of course, in the late 70s, early 80s, you had Star Wars. And Star Wars itself has all manner of, what you people say, Eastern philosophy, but a lot of, I would say, Taoism and Buddhism within its worldview and understanding. Some other just dharmic faiths. So in the 90s, you see a real loss of Christianity. Even though they had the whole boom of Christianity, where you had the, what would you call it, the revivalist movements. Big tent revivals came back in the 90s. You had all these different Christian groups for after church things, and Bible schools and stuff. Still, you had somewhat of a loss of core Christianity, more of a loss of children going to church as much, or being raised in the Christian aspect, right? So, and then they get more exposure to paganism, I would say, via Japanese anime. And then also in the late 90s, you had things like, of course, we are discussed um, things like uh, Star Wars, but then we also have Harry Potter coming up in the late 90s, early thousands. And then later in the early thousands, you get the Lord of the Rings boom and a return to even more Dungeons and Dragons. Of course, I'm ignoring other popular franchises like Final Fantasy and other things like that. But mostly I'm focused on these core ones. So Final Fantasy didn't really get as popular till later on. Pokemon is another one, but I don't think Pokemon, except for Christians having a satanic panic concept with Pokemon, I don't think Pokemon was ever a real religious spiritual thing for kids until later on. So this loss of Christian tradition didn't have a solid foundation for proper pagan focus for some of these children or teenagers. And the result was in things like Zelda becoming a spiritual tradition to some, much like Star Wars was before it. You see these groups have even gone through the phases. I'll talk about the phases later, but you can see that in Star Wars. Star Wars started off as like a spiritual movement almost with some of these people who grafted to Star Wars. And then it went through its fundamentalist phases, and now it's gone through, just like the church in Christianity, it's gone through its woke phases, and now people are split between the fundamentalists and then the fundamentalist conservative, and then the left kind of open-minded woke kind of concept with Star Wars itself. It's almost like it's a religion. Unfortunately, they even have like the religion of Jedi and Jediism or whatever. That even I think the U.S. military apparently, I think even maybe the British military, I don't know if that's true, actually recognizes as something that their service members can identify as, which is grade A stupid in my opinion. But with that, so I'm talking about Star Wars. Zelda had something similar. While Star Wars fans would turn to Buddhism or Taoism, Zelda fans, some of them have turned to real paganism, because there's a lot of real paganism within Zelda. And others turn to basically Zelda fandom itself, which basically gives them a sense of religion based on real religion. So there's enough aspects of real religions and I would say the formula or structure that seems like a real pagan-based structures for people to be into Zelda with and replace it when they weren't given anything. It gave them substance as meaning, so substance and meaning to their life, as well as a common community, like a sense of community, which until the last few years, the sense of community with the Zelda fans wasn't really politicized. It was a common love of the Zelda universe and the story and the morals and the ideas in Zelda. Zelda craze kind of got to the point where people have, tattoos of the Legend of Zelda, the Triforce. They name their, was it Robin Williams named his daughter Zelda, and apparently that was after the actual princess in the game. All of that aside, the Zelda craze is obviously a thing. It still kind of goes on today. It wasn't paganized the last few years, and everybody was united under a pan 80s, 90s, and 2000s spirituality and love of Zelda. So the spirit of Zelda and the love of the Zelda franchise and its morals and its storylines and its characters and its timelines, etc., didn't really have much of a divide between the 80s, 90s, 2000s. It was sort of like one coherent just love of this franchise, which for some people, like I'm saying, kind of became a spirituality. The stories and symbolism and meaning gave purpose to people's lives. I would argue that basically the three religions, like the three Abrahamic religions of people say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, though we could argue that with current Judaism is actually older Judaism and was more born out of Christianity, but we won't get there. But those three are basically, you can see Star Wars, Zelda, and Harry Potter are sort of the three for younger generations who didn't have a religious foundation and turned to these spiritual ideas and and structures within these franchises as their religion. I mean, yes, I am ignoring things like Marvel comics, etc., because I mean, people liked the comic books and some people loved them, but it wasn't until probably the last few years or so that the Marvel universe became these people's religious identity, which to me is one of the worst ones because it would offer no real morality anymore, just feelings. But these are all real religions anyways, so in general, I'm not going to hold them to a proper standard. I would say Pokemon and Dragon Ball have also a good mix of things after a while, where a lot of people have spiritually associated Pokemon and Dragon Ball. I would say Dragon Ball ends up being grafted onto people's religion, even though it's a very Buddhist storyline with some Shintoism, but mostly Buddhist and Hindu. But for some reason, everybody who likes Dragon Ball Z, especially in South American countries, etc., seem to like graft Jesus and Goku together, where Goku's just God's strongest Saiyan or something like that. It is what it is. So general paganism. So games kind of have a pagan inspiration to some degree. Shouldn't be a default religion, but religious expression in mediums is to be expected, and those who find a spiritual connection to literature or entertainment shouldn't be shunned. Though it shouldn't replace true faith, it can inspire and influence it as well. Entertainment, of course, has been around forever. While our lore for pagans is sacred and profound, with direct meaning, wisdom, spirituality, magic, it is also something that was retold and brought to life around a campfire via storytellers. Oral traditions often worked via storytelling in general. Thereby, faith was spread. Faith became culture and is expressed in everything from toys to writings to architecture to tattoos and art. With the lack of proper folk and natural religions in the past, it is no wonder why people gravitated to seeing fantasy stories such as Lord of the Rings, which has a lot of Germanic culture in it, and some Celtic, Zelda, the Elder Scrolls, Final Fantasy, etc., as some sort of spiritual identity for them. While these things aren't inherently religious in nature, and anyone who upholds them to such should be redirected to an actual faith, one can see why they would latch onto them, and where these fantasy elements contain actual hints of lore, culture, and faith of the past and paganism in general. With this, as requested, I will take a small dive into the spirituality of the Legend of Zelda series and what's presented within. So, we'll go ahead and address sort of what people always kind of want addressed at first, and then that's the argument that the Legend of Zelda is Christian. And I will say the Legend of Zelda has heavy allegory in it, both ways. Yes, first of all, when you think anything is Christian, you have to understand that in Japan, the West, especially in fantasy, ends up being a sort of hodgepodge mixture of Christianity, European paganism, Roman concepts, and sometimes even some Middle Eastern ideas. So, yes, there's Japanese artists and writers who heavily do their research and really understand what's going on in like paganism, for instance. But then on the other hand, when you get around those who did a lot of research, you'll get the general fantasy. And to Japan, general fantasy, believe me, I live here, I speak the language. General fantasy often incorporates Christian elements with Nordic elements and Celtic elements, and they'll have Christian magic, and basically see it as Christian magic, and they'll be using runes and crosses, and these runes and crosses will be represented as not really Jesus, but as just a Western magic idea. So alchemy and occultism will mix a lot of different pagan elements and Christian elements together, and that's how Japan likes to present fantasy of the West. That's why you'll see these holy knights in anime or games that are like fantasy, who are like Knights Templar, but they worship like a goddess, but then they may have other gods, or they have angels and talk about one god. And unless it's a series that's really serious and did its research, it's going to be a hodgepodge mix of fantasy and actual elements. So yes, were originally in the first Zelda series there was artwork where Link basically had Pilgrim's Progress. He had a lot of Pilgrim's Progress ideas. He went through and met different characters along his way to rescuing this princess in this very, I don't know what you would say, Sleeping Beauty-esque kind of save the princess idea. And he had a cross on his shield, almost like he wore the armor of the Bible, the cross and the sword, the truth and the spirit, all the different aspects of that. But the idea is that him having a cross is just seen to them is no different than Templars having crosses. It's just a mystical cross. There was artwork floating around that showed, and some people say it was original artwork. I can't find the actual source on it, but I'm not going to go that deep into it. But it showed like Link praying before an actual crucifix that depicted Jesus. And they had like churches for a while that seemed kind of Christian-like. That aside, I'm honestly, I think that's about the majority of Christian elements. Of course, this is a game series. It has allegory. But from what you know with the creator, Shigeru Miyamoto, a lot of his stuff was he said that he imagined that Link was just basically doing what he did in his childhood, go out and play in the forest and imagine these adventures. And honestly, his forest is going to be full of Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. If you're Miyamoto going out in the forest and seeing actual rural Japan. So you're going to see a lot more, even if he was to throw in Western pagan ideas or even Western Christian ideas, that they're going to be through a Buddhist Shinto lens, just of a Japanese understanding. Yes, you have a flood story. Some people like to throw the flood story. In the Wind Waker game, it's sort of a flood story and sort of a post-apocalyptic, antediluvian world kind of setting. Though I would argue, for those who are into the Atlantean, which I'm not very happy with the Atlantean ideas, but that's a different story and a different argument for a different time. The Atlantean ideas so maybe Hyrule in that idea that game functions more as an Atlantis, and then they're all these almost like the Hyruleans are almost like Aryans trying to revive their Atlantis coming forth. But that's a possibility in that game. Not something I really put a lot of banking on. So I'll say the core aspect of the Zelda series, right, is basically you have the goddesses in Zelda, right? And so these three goddesses, right? So it's a trinity. So you have Din, the goddess of power, Nairu, the goddess of wisdom, and Faeror, the goddess of courage. So you have power, wisdom, and courage. So this trinity, as it were, which some people say is this also a Christian idea. This trinity basically makes up an understanding of their faith. Basically, the whole world revolves around the powers of these three powers in the Triforce. It's not Christian per se. Christianity took a lot of its trinity, in my opinion, and what I've written in my books and a lot of my research of more of an esoteric concepts, but Christianity took a lot of its trinity ideas from previous Indo-European tripartite concepts, things of the father, the mother, the child, the father, the striker's son. So basically, you're going to have king, priest, warrior, and producer. You have just these different trinities. The Celtic Trinity, while it was quickly adapted to Christianity, has definitely a pagan aspect before that we could link to, and in the Celto-Germanic areas and even in Norse areas that were adapted to Celto-Germanic. You have Trinity knots as well. You have different tri-scales, Trinity knots. Even the Volknot is kind of a three kind of symbols together. Three makes nine. And also, if you could see another pagan aspects of that, the three goddesses that are spoken of, that kind of, they, even though they control the world, they kind of definitely works as the three primary fates, or the three Norn, or the three primary Nornir, um, the Norns. You have the Matrone in the different like goddess cults. You have Hecate, who's a Trinity goddess. You have this like a sort of Trinity goddess thing, which is more of a modern Wicca thing, but definitely a theme of it within Celtic paganism. In general, the Trinity, you have Triglav in the Slavic, which is a three-headed god. It's not uncommon to have a Trinity. Even the Trimurti, which is some people say it's a modern adaptation, but Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva or Rudra. Those are all trinities, right? So it can easily be seen with that. And then they leave a goddess of sorts, which is Hylia goddess, right? And so the Hylia goddess kind of works a little bit in general of every kind of goddess idea. They come, they leave her. Some people have connected it to like the Japanese gods creating the world and then leaving behind Amaterasu, the goddess. But that's not really the case, because I saw a YouTuber who mentioned that, and I think he's wrong because he doesn't fully understand Japanese Shinto beliefs. There's multiple gods that came before and after Amaterasu. She is just the highest dawn goddess that ends up being sort of the representation of the sun for Japan and for the Yamato clan. There were lots of gods that are still technically are above her in the cosmology of Japan. But that being said, Hylia goddess kind of works like Danu, the goddess Danu, like the Tuatha De Dana. So you have she represents these elf-like, Aryan-like Hylians, right, from Hyrule, and they kind of work in the land, and everything is about their religion, and they sort of appear on the scene afterwards, and depending on the tale, and fight off this chaos of Ganondorf, which is sort of the chaos. So you have a sort of a chaos versus order idea of Ganondorf, who's extreme chaos or darkness, versus and he's just a physical, basically Calamity Ganon is this idea of this physical miasma of just embodiment of chaos. And they sort of bring order to the chaos as Hylians and their worship of the gods. And they have other gods they mentioned as well, but specifically the goddess bringing light through this trinity to sort of make order and stake their grounds. Of course, there's other races and beings and other spirits and gods. Animism is very much a part of this series. And speaking of spirits and gods, you have a lot of tree worship and forest spirits. The Deku tree is sort of almost like an Yggdrasil-like tree of life. He has if you think the Hylians are very much elf-like, you have the different beings that like the Kokori, I think is what they're called. The different beings in Zelda that are like more childlike, and they actually are kind of the Kokiri, right? The Kokiri are like the children of the forest, but the Koroks are like their older form of them, and they're literally like forest spirits, but kind of function as like perpetual children who have a wisdom to them that serve with this tree, but also are kind of ancient, almost as if they're ancient ancestors. That's a whole aspect to it as well. So there's tree worship there. There's a lot of different tree worships, the different Deku shrubs, and different just ideas that nature is also a sacred part of the world and a sacred embodied with those three goddesses, or the Triforce. And the Triforce almost works like people call it Triforce of power. It has power to it. It almost works as like a balancing energy, like a constant spirit, a ki or chi, as if you were a prana, or the various different aether, or various different ideas that we have in the West as well, for Indo-European concepts. But it also has this idea where the Triforce itself brings forth a power. It's very much associated with water too. You'll see these temples where pieces of the Triforce kind of flow with the water, and then the fairies who have the different fairies, kind of like fae in general. They're very much like Celtic fairies in some ways. Some maybe a little more like different Apsara in the Vedic tradition. They're almost like messengers and representations, or angels in some ways, of the goddesses, and their holy water that they have is like drinkable, and the fairies themselves give you power, and their holy fountains that they have sort of function as this whole soma, halma, amrita, nectar of the gods, holy mead of poetry kind of idea. The well springs, they almost have like a wellspring of like Erd's well or Mimir's well. So you definitely have that pagan aspect of these holy wells that you come and pray to. I know Survive the Jive has done a good video about praying at holy springs and holy wells across parts of Europe, specifically he covers Britain. But these are really, really cool aspects of it that I think are very pagan. You can see these fairy springs are very much an idea like that. Just going through the list here, of course, there's different monsters and spirits. Of course, the Hyrulean or Hylian religion and spirituality is, you have these temples. Each temple is dedicated to usually an element, and then these different elements kind of work similar to the. There's usually about 4 elements, but sometimes they're at 5. They're very similar to the kind of Greco understanding of the elements, but they can also work as a Shinto understanding with the 5, which we're going to have 5 different elements. Usually wood is part of it. So usually you would have, like in a Taoist concept, which was Shinto pulls it from Taoism, you're going to have earth, wood, metal or gold, water, and then fire. And usually the temples follow something like that. With the core 3 of these trinities, these temples will have the trinity of the 3 different primary aspects of the goddesses that are used as a jewel or some sort to sort of revive the goddesses. In the newer games, there's even more religious aspects than there were in the older games. Because the older games, you would just see temples that may have alluded to Buddhism, or temples that alluded to different European pagan areas, depending on where you're at. Or I'll get into the Islamic or Middle Eastern, Eurasian kind of idea of certain temples. But you get all of that together, and they're represented. Now, the newer games, they're straight up shrines that you can pray to, full-on temples, and the goddess Hylia is mentioned more often, more than just the Trinity goddesses, and it's more of a fleshed out religion. So they're sort of giving themselves an actual religion instead of just taking all the aspects from other religions and sort of peppering them in. But it does give it a decent lore. Of course, there's always a little bit of reality within fiction, and that's kind of what we're looking at here, right? Of course, I don't want to go into all the lore of, and this is not a lore video, it's more of a religious breakdown video. I want to go into the lore of the other races and other beings within Zelda. It's a little bit too much. Like I said, you can see in a lot of statues and things that just the religious aspects, ideas of the third eye, and a lot of the different statues. And then the third eye really comes up in the Sheikah people. And we'll talk about the Sheikah, the Sheiks, or whatever they're called. But the Sheikah are definitely an interesting aspect in themselves. But yeah, so I said the primary goddess, has a sort of a paramita kind of idea too, where she's the goddess. She represents wisdom in general. Also, they have a priest class. the priest class is very interesting. So you have 7 wise men. These 7 wise men in the priest class basically all are the protectors of the Triforce, or protectors of their temple or their element, depending on the game, right? And sometimes you have 7 maidens that go with it as well, but I won't get into that as much. Of course, the 7 is very interesting. You have the idea of like 7 sages of Manu, of the founder. Basically, he's kind of like a demigod, but he's sort of like the Noah figure in some ways of in Vedic ideas of Manu, and he wrote forth the law, and he gives forth these rishi like 7 sage guys who spread it forth, and then that's all, of course, in some tellings like that, right? But then in the Zoroastrian, you have Ahura Mazda, right? Now, Ahura Mazda is the primary god, I would say, the supreme being in some ways, and he represents both the Sky Father, though I could go a whole video talking about what his connections are to both water and the sky, and possibly, Varuna, the god Varuna. But of course, he has Mithra, and we'll get into Mithra in a second here too. The Zoroastrianism, I feel, was heavier in some of the Zelda aspects than not, and which is why I want to talk about it. Is he has 7 people modernly call them angels. They're definitely Vedic gods adapted into the Iranian understanding or the Persian understanding. The 7 Spentamayinu, right? The Spentamayinu are 7. The like 7 Spenta. There's 7 spirits or angels or gods basically, who are aspects of him, almost kind of like rays of light coming down from him, emanations of him, but they're their own beings as well, and they represent a different virtue. And it's kind of interesting because the trinity of the 3 goddesses, and then you have a trinity somewhat with Ahura Mazda, the god Mithra, or Mithras, or Mitra, and then a little bit in the darker god Angramayanu, or I'm trying to remember his other name, but so Angramayanu is the other god like that, and then the 3 gods like that present. You see a lot of Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf or Ganon in this trinity as well, and each one of them usually inherits. Usually Link is the Triforce of courage, and Zelda is the Triforce of wisdom, and Ganon is the Triforce of power. And so there's a lot of different, I would say, really heavily Persian aspects to it. Link wears a Frisian cap that's really long. He also, at one point, usually in the fire dungeons, he gets a red tunic. He has a very Scythian look to him at that point. He rides on a horseback, uses an arrow. It's like a master riding a horseback, or just using an arrow in general. It's a very play with Scythian beings, or Scythian, concepts being in the world, which also works with the Persian aspect. I mean, even though the kingdom is very European, it has a lot of Indo-European concepts, and I would just say the Persian really stands in. The Sheikah are this beings that are kind of like ninjas, and they work kind of like assassins, right? So, but they protect and they make them full out ninjas in the newer games, right? Because the newer games are very much more Shinto, very much more like, I don't know, Eastern look and Eastern philosophy styles. But in the older games, they kind of stood out as like these kind of ninja aspects. And this might be a kind of me sort of, grasping at straws here, but the assassins, right? So the word assassin, make sure I get this right when I'm saying it, because I'm pretty sure, if I remember, that the word assassin actually comes from a Persian word, right? and I'm pretty sure it's actually Arabic, but it was adapted into Persian Arabic. But it's it was like Hasashin or Hasashi, and then some people saying it was like hashish eaters because basically it was a derogatory name that these people would take it to take hashish or the any kind of tropic drugs to get their power, etc. But but the idea was that they were sometimes a group within Persia that were understood to be sent on to do killings, etc., and or to have protections of like the throne. The idea with the Shika is a very kind of Persian idea with that as well. I've noticed there's this sort of the Shika also have a very Vedic way of worshiping. They also have they also have a whole allegory thing in the newer ones and or kind of tantric Buddhist where the Shika who are the most high priest like do a form of monk like asceticism where there's a group of monks and I can go into this deeper some other who basically pickle themselves, right? And so this is called Shokushin Butsu in Japanese, right? There are these Buddhist monks that basically mummify themselves alive. They do a diet that basically pickles themselves slowly as they're constantly praying. And then at one point, they'll be in a meditative area where they'll actually bury them and have like a bell for them to ring and like a breathing area. And they get to the point where they're dying. And when they die, they actually are like, after doing this diet, they're actually almost fully preserved, right? And the idea is that they're in this caught in between heaven and earth. And then they can make a sort of intermediate connection to Tsuita heaven, which is basically the heaven for Maitreya Buddha, right? So Maitreya Buddha is, or Miroku in Japanese. Maitreya Buddha is the Buddha to come, right? But Maitreya Buddha actually comes from Mithra. So he's directly connected to the god Mitra or Mithra, right? So Mithra is the Buddha, is also the Buddha to come and to bring forth this this new heaven, this golden age, right? This new turning of the Dharma. Well, you have Link, right? So Link fights Ganondorf. Well, Link fighting Ganondorf, who usually takes the form of a pig, but sometimes a bull-like creature. It's like I don't even want to say it's like a boar, but his slaying of that boar / bull like Ganondorf, the final form, and this is a stretch maybe, could represent the tautology of the slaying of the bull for Mithras. So I mean it's just one of those things that I would think, and you can't really say that you don't see it in some ways when you see Mithras and how he looks and how he wears that Frisian cap and the tunic and he has the blade and he has, of course, a lot of times the sun or the gods look at him or the sun gods look at him as he kills the bull. It's very much you can see where Zelda took that inspiration as well. There's a lot more aspects, I would say, between the concept of Mithraism and the bull slaying or the Trachtoni or the Frisian cap and Link. But I would go further and say that there's also an aspect between Ganondorf, who, like I said, may represent Angrimainu, may represent the god Mara and the Buddhist Angkor Mainu also, I want to say, goes off as Ariman. So in case you want to get that right, Ariman is another aspect or name for him. But he goes as that. But also they have a kingdom, right? Which we could say is Persia, but we could also say is the West, the Crusader kingdoms, etc. of Europeans, right? And Ganondorf is a he's born, so he has a lot of different aspects to him, Ganon or Ganondorf. But he's born of a thief clan, right? And this may be controversial to some people, but he's born of a thief clan. He has they reside in the desert. He has this is his human iteration because he's been reincarnated. All these people have been all these stories. They've been reincarnated multiple times. So he's born as a human with a red beard, a rather, I guess, what you would say, Semitic style nose, darker skin, from a desert tribe, and he basically either convinces Hyrule to be his friend and then attacks them and takes them over, or he leads an army of darkness against the Hyrulean kingdom, right? Subverts them from within or attacks them externally and brings forth chaos. And I hate to say, I know people don't like it, a very jihadist Islamic presentation to him. This is just something that he presents. So even in the Fire Temple, which were his people's first kind of presentation is seen, you can see that they originally in the Legend in 64 Ocarina of Time, they had a half moon, a crescent moon, and a star, literally, and they used different Islamic prayers in the backgrounds of these temples. But I will show the aspect is that both the Hyruleans, even though Hyruleans had water, they also had fire, and so does Ganon's people. Give me one moment because I'm actually doing a little research while I'm doing it. I'm not going to even lie. I can't keep up with all the lore. I can just keep up with how I interpret it. Ganondorf has, let's see, he is, Garuda, the Garuda people, right? So they say he's a warlock or whatever else from the Garuda people. He is also born, he's sort of like the reincarnation of this evil force of the Demon King demise over and over and over. But he in that Legend of Zelda, the fire worship is present, but he also has like two mothers because the Garuda tribe only they also, even though I have the Islamic portion, they also have a Amazonian idea, like an Amazonian Scythian, like the Amazonian Scythian women were, or what may have been considered to inspire the Amazons. There's a bunch of people that they're considered to inspire the idea of Amazons, but these strong women who are warrior bands together, who could fight and kill. The idea of them is kind of taken into the Garuda, and so they kind of only bring forth a male heir who becomes Ganon every so many years is the idea, which is a really interesting concept as well. That the Gerudo, but the Gerudo, like at one point, these seer-like witches basically join together to become one woman, and then I don't know who they have relations with, but they produce Ganon in some ways. So it's interesting. The concept of that is interesting because Ganon is always this force that basically could be seen as this Middle Eastern, but also Eurasian, possibly Scythian, but also possibly the Islamic invader kind of idea, that sort of, or even Turco kind of Islamic idea that spreads and comes forth and brings this chaos back. That is, of course, just one idea. The cyclical times. So, as you know, in most Indo-European faiths, time is cyclical. In the cycle of time, there's a lot of reincarnation. There's a lot of connections to the past lives and to the concept of what will be the future, and of course balance of chaos and order. And you have that a lot in the Legend of Zelda, because each game iteration is a new, not each game, but depending on the game iteration, it's a new incarnation of Link, incarnation of Zelda, continuing of Hyrule Kingdom in sort of a timeline, but an re-emerging of the chaos that is Ganondorf and having to fight him. So yes, Ganon has a very Muhammad-like aspect to him that they have to fight and put down. Let me see. There's a few other things I was going to point out. Oh, so Link is in case people didn't know, because a lot of people modernly like to make the Legend of Zelda some kind of, everybody unfortunately on the political spectrum leaning towards the left likes to co-opt and adapt everything that's from Japan or from any media at all and ruin it so that basically it's only seeable through whatever their lens is, and if you don't see it through that, you're canceled or you're evil or whatever else. But I do want to put forth that almost in every iteration, Link is a royalist. He is a monarchist. He is a restorationalist for the monarchy. If he's not related to Zelda, he either in a family line or in a I'm going to marry her line. It's a wanting to restore her to the throne, because usually something happened to her father, and he's a loyal servant to restoring Hyrule and defeating the chaos that is Ganon. And Ganon has two mothers. That was just to throw that in there, but in general, you can see political aspects of allegory in both sides of things like Legend of Zelda or any video game, anime, book, novel series, etc. But not seeing the monarchy and conservative values within the Legend of Zelda. I don't know what's wrong with you if you don't. So other things, like I said, there's a lot of flame worship, which is also a very heavy thing. Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism has a lot of flames. He's worshipped through an eternal flame, almost similar to the Vestal Virgins who worshipped in the same way in Mars. Other things you can find is the goddess Epona, which is the horse and warrior goddess, but she's also had a few other aspects to her for the Gauls, and of course what was that was the Gauls' land, but the Gallo-Romans later, and then of course became France and a few different areas of that region of Celtic and Germanic regions. The Gauls had Epona. Epona is the name of Link's horse in at least 3 games, if not 4 games. You have you have these, one point they have frogs that are definitely the gods Fuji and Raijin of Japanese Shintoism, even though I would say Fuji and Raijin are inspired by Vedic gods and Buddhism as well. So there's a whole different, if people are interested, there's a whole different offshoot I can go with it. Honestly, if this is a ramble and I'm just making this episode for the fun of it, but if anyone's interested in any of these topics I'm putting forth, or you want me to expound upon any of it, let me know. I'll try to make a small video on it or explain it the best I can. Of course, you can see Link as multiple things, right? And I kind of want to end it on these kind of ideas. You can see the culture of The Legend of Zelda to be a European castles with different cultures around it, like the desert people, the mountainous people, or kind of have this fantasy dwarf-like for the different races, and the forest kind of guys. And I'm not going to go into all of the different lores about which of these beings exist and their names in each game or whatever, but my thing is there's a lot of allegory in all of that. But you can see Link as European, obviously. You can see Link as a Celt or a Germanic warrior. You could see him as a pilgrim going on like a crusade, or having a pilgrim's progress to defeat evil and learn about himself and come to the light of God. But it's going to be really hard if you're a Christian using allegory and you have so many gods, goddesses, and magic involved. It doesn't really make much sense. You can see him as a Scythian warrior or a hunter wearing a Frisian cap. But there's also heavy honor codes, a morality, a warrior's code, a lot of swordsmanship that's talking about where he's kind of like a samurai learning the swordsmanship. And there's a sense of duty and nationalism, heritage, and sort of a blood and soil idea that goes into Link and his care for Hyrule and the people of Hyrule, but also for his care for trying to restore Hyrule and restore the kingdom of Hyrule to the land. That's basically what I got. It's a quick summary. It is not in depth. I probably messed up a few names. I didn't want to go into it a lot because honestly, this is not a chance. I don't mind talking about pop culture, and honestly, I would talk more about pop culture if people wanted me to talk about it. Is as it has to do with Indo-European paganism in general, or spirituality. I don't plan on having conversations about just pop culture all the time. My focus is primarily going to be on religion and actually promoting Indo-European religions, specifically the ones that I am initiated into of Vajrayana Buddhism and Germanic paganism. But I definitely like going down these rabbit holes, and I feel that if people want me to go to talk about it more, and it bring in through these unravelings, it can not only help you analyze the symbolism and things that you actually watch and read and listen to, but you can also, learn from it and take symbolism and the world around you into your own spirituality and apply it somehow. I'm not saying get Triforce tattoos, but I'm saying appreciate maybe the lessons learned in there and then see the lessons learned in other actual religious texts, or maybe it can give you a key to understanding them. I think that's a great thing, and I have no problem talking about it more. So I hope you all enjoyed this small, I wouldn't say really deep dive, but small understanding and small interpretation on my end, sifting through the allegories. That is basically the cult of Legend of Zelda and its fan following, and what could potentially be even a better way to understand the series and not allow people to sort of take a pop culture icon from you that has such a religious value and spiritual value for the time and for this current worldview of the last 3 generations or so. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll make more episodes, as it comes. Thank you very much for your time. Peace.